Welcome back to Keeping It Real with Mani and Lonnie. Your girls are here to bring important conversations to the table and always keep it 100. Make sure to tune in to our first episode if you haven't already to hear our perspective on college and if it's really worth it.
So we're going to start a little tradition around here where we share our favorite tweet of the week. So with that being said, Lonnie, do you want to share your tweet of the week?
My tweet is by Bap, and her @name is The Queen Speaks, and she wrote, "We critique colorism on TV and in movies way more than we do with each other, and I'm just really tired, y'all." And I think that's so interesting because that's one thing Mani and I really have just like noticed a lot is like everyone's always talking about, oh, in this show, for example, with like, what is it? Girlfriends, there you go. There's multiple moments where, hella colorist moments happen and everyone always is talking about that on Twitter and no one's really having a conversation about like how in like the real world it is presented. And
I also feel like it's easier to analyze shows because it's not real, right? Like we're like, oh, that character, we like think like we'd be going in, we'd be like, oh, they're hella colorist, this is that, and then it's like no one really, you can have Twitter beef over characters all the time, doesn't mean anything, but no one wants to talk about like themselves and get roasted. So I feel like that's why it's so much easier for us. 'Cause I feel like that's trending all the time. But I feel like that relates to the tweet that I have on like us not really talking about colorism like that. This girl's is, I can't even say this, but it's at NAAGWALN. I don't know what that means. But she said, y'all be like, unpack your colorism, and then the colorism in question. I don't think dark skinned women are humans. I just be like, it really be like that though, like the jump. It's like we never talk about it, but when we do, it's just like you just hear the most disgusting stuff and you're like, this is why we need to talk about it. But it's like no one wants to talk about it. So we're
yeah,
like back to square one.
yeah, everyone's favorite thing to do is like pose a dehumanizing question about black women, like dark skinned black women, and then debate about it. And it's like, well, why is this conversation not brought up when, somebody is doing something hella fishy as a light skinned person? So,
Period.
everyone's favorite thing to do. But
I mean, that's the issue, that it's like we pick and choose what we feel comfortable with dissecting, but it's like it's always so far removed from ourselves. It's like, what was the point of that conversation if you just wanted to start a Twitter war on something that shouldn't be a Twitter? Like, it's just weird. I don't get the point.
I feel like also that comfortability comes from a sense of people being scared that they're, going to be problematic for what they say or how they perceive things based off of the skin tone that they have or the way like the system is set up and how people are either going to hate what they're saying or love what they're saying and agree with them. And even in like on Twitter and stuff, they will like black men will bring up conversation starters like, oh, well, people are mad that light-skinned women are always chosen, or dark-skinned men will talk about, oh, well, black women are the most unprotected group of people. And it's just the most randomest conversation, like the randomest tweets that are brought up, and then how we have conversations about it. It's just so reactive. And then on top of that, people are trying to resolve it in the sense of like just resolving that tweet and not the whole issue. There's such a bigger issue with colorism, and it's so blanketed in the way that we talk about it and the way that we cover the issues that are brought up from colorism.
Yeah, I just hate how nitpicky people are on Twitter, and it's like we never really talk about the actual like root of the issue. It's always about, oh, we're gonna drag this person because they're a colorist, and then it's like, people forget about it the next day, and then next week another black person or like a random person do something colorist, and then we all back at it again. But it's like we never talk about like the deeper, like how this affects people on the day to day, what that looks like, how we've been living with colorism since the beginning of time. Like we never really deconstruct anything. We're just kind of like, oh, you're a colorist, and then everyone on Twitter drags them, and then they like don't respond, and then we never like talk about it again until something else happens. And like you said, it's always a reaction to something. We never just be like, let's talk about this. That never really happens. It's always like something bad happens, so we gotta check them.
Yeah, and I think also when we like cancel culture is such a big thing, so we're so willing to always just cancel somebody and then continue on with our day, and it's no one's really learning. So we've left like this idea of like learning culture and trying to stop people from having colorist values in, you know, teaching them like, okay, well, like, this is what you shouldn't believe in, this is what you shouldn't perpetuate when it comes to colorism. And so now you have a whole bunch of colorists that are on the ban list, and no one's talking about, you know, the stuff that they said and why it has to be deconstructed and canceled, the conversations in general, but not cancel the individual, and actually like deconstructing why they even had those perspectives in the first place.
So, in your opinion, do you think that people can move away from like making those, cancel culture comments and make a breakthrough with people? Because, like, honestly, I haven't seen it yet. Like, most of the time when people do that, it just ends in like beef and dragging people and calling people out of their name. And then it just, next caller, like, we just do it to the next person. Like, I haven't seen anyone be like, oh my God, please tell me why what I said was problematic, or how I'm being a colorist. Like, I've never seen that happen. So, what do you think?
Yeah, I think one thing that's a huge issue is people are always taking defense to their self before they can even listen to what people are saying. So we have a problem as a society of even just trying to accept any type of learning experience that we can have. So let's say, for example, like I'm being super colorist and you're trying to check me on it, right? The first thing, like the first instinct I have, because of the way society always reacts to colorist people, or just the way that even in social media we act towards it, my first instinct is going to be defensive of like my identity, the person that I am, everything. And I'm already thinking of you as the enemy. And the problem is you might have like the most purest intention of just trying to help me understand why I'm problematic, but then it becomes a problem when I interpret it completely wrong, and then there's no way that we can, you know, create a space where we can have that conversation and two people are coming out of it as, okay, we learned something, we're not going to be colorist anymore, and that's it. It's like the person who's trying to educate you on why you're being colorist, and you know, a lot of times it's dark skinned women trying to educate light skinned women about these issues. And so light skinned women always feel like they have to be defensive, and that's the problematic part, is dark skinned women are trying to be as vulnerable as possible, as they can be, about the issues that they're dealing with. And then when we as light skinned women are sitting there not being accepting of it, there is no space to actually grow as individuals and be trusted by dark skinned women.
Yeah, just going off of that, I also feel like it becomes a little bit of like oppression Olympics, right? Because it's like light skin, as a lighter skinned woman, I will never know what it feels like to navigate this world as a darker skinned woman, right? So when they're speaking on an experience that I can't relate to, it's like shutdown mode. It's like, nah, like that makes me feel uncomfortable. Therefore, I'm gonna just come up here with my own rhetoric to make myself feel better. And that's like hella disappointing because at the end of the day, like, we're supposed to be supporting each other in our own struggles, and we already know how hard it is in the world. So it's just very disappointing to see that, like, you could have just sat down and listened to what other people had to say, but you chose, like, the defense mode and just, shut down real quick. And it's like disappointing because there's so many more like positive outcomes that could come out of that. Because imagine if we all were educating ourselves on this topic and like really aware, because I feel like we are aware, but we could be more aware, and we don't have the space to like really deconstruct it and like talk about it. So I wish it was more normalized. I feel like it is in pop culture now. Like, people will call out colorism, but I feel like it's not called out in like our day to day or our families or just our life. It's just always like from the abstract, like the media. That person over there is a bad person because they're a colorist, but we won't ever like look into ourselves and like see the faults that we have or what we carry nowadays, I guess.
I have, you know, deconstructed a lot of the ways in which I once valued a lot of colorism in my life, and, you know, noticed that how much I was benefiting off of it and was okay with that. Is there a time where you benefited off of colorism and you were okay with it, or when you were valuing of something that was very colorist of you to do?
Yeah, I feel like there's been numerous times when I was younger and even in my adult life where people will compliment me and it's a direct correlation to my skin tone, right? So someone could be like, you look very beautiful, love your fit, something like that's neutral. But I've had comments where it's directly like, your skin tone is very beautiful because da, da, da. And it's like because of the lighter skin tone. It's not just because like my melanin is beautiful or something like that. And I've just kind of been like, things, but I never really like was like, oh, I'm gonna check them because I was colorist. Like I'm just kind of like, do I check them? Do I let it slide? And I feel like that's the privilege part, right? Because I could just keep it pushing and act like it didn't happen, or I could force it and try to check them right then and there.
Yeah, I can agree with that because multiple times in my life I've had, people, it can be just like a general compliment from like some random stranger, or it can just be, within my family as well. Having people just compliment my skin tone and me just being okay with that, knowing consciously, like, oh, obviously they only think of me to be beautiful because I follow more of a Eurocentric standard in the way that we perceive beauty. So because of my light skin, I'm gonna always be seen by like the media and the way that the system is set up as uh, a more beautiful, more accepted version of a Black woman. So that was something that I had to deconstruct with myself for a while and realize that it wasn't benefiting me more or less by accepting those types of compliments or accepting those types of conversations, when in reality I was not only hurting myself, but I was hurting those around me, because obviously it's not a one skin tone type world. There's going to be different skin tone complexions, and all of them are beautiful. Like, all Black women are beautiful, but the problem is when we live in a society that values Eurocentric features and having lighter skin. When you are light skin and love to, benefit off of that light skin um, privileges, then it becomes you're degrading dark skinned people. So that was something that I had to really come to terms with and understand, okay, this is something I'm doing that's wrong.
Yeah, and going off of that, like knowing that my skin tone was like the desirable skin tone, right? Like people be getting tans and stuff. They're not trying to be hella dark. They're trying to be a certain shade when they're getting tans. Like when what people are basically like blackfishing or trying to like put our skin tone in the media, it's a certain shade and it's always a lighter shade of blackness. So getting comments about like, oh, I just love your skin tone is just like, you just got to nip it in the bud. Like and I never said anything because I was like, I don't want to be that person. Like, I don't want to be that person to be like exaggerating when I'm in a place of privilege. But at the end of the day, it's like, if I'm silent, then that means I'm allowing this to continue, which is super problematic. And so I feel like for the longest, I was playing into it. And I also, even if I knew I was benefiting, I just didn't want to address it because I was like, I don't want to be that person. I'm like, now I don't care, but like then I was really just like, I don't want no problems. Like I'm gonna just kiki haha get through the day. Like I just don't want to deal with it. But it's like getting to a point where it's like colorism is just so anti-black that it's like, how can I preach that I'm pro-black, but I'm being hella silent on colorism? Like those two just can't coexist for me. So I've just realized that I need to get out of my comfort and just say what it is, because otherwise I'm being a coon. Like that's just not okay.
Right. I know, just even speaking on like, being pro-Black, believing in like Black Lives Matter and stuff like that, it's so important to also deconstruct, okay, well, I can't sit there and critique a white person for not accepting that they have multiple benefits that they gain from, the system, the white supremacy and just our system, and not even correct myself in how I benefit from colorism, and that if I'm not deconstructing it and combating it on a daily basis, then I too am conforming with what the system has already brought, which is injustice to Black people. And then with colorism, injustice is even larger for dark-skinned Black people.
And like you just reminded me of like social movements, like a lot of Black movements, who's the head, like lighter skinned people, women and men. So it's like it's just disappointing that like even within our own communities we're like internalizing this stuff. Like it's not going anywhere, right? There's a reason why lighter skinned people, there's a reason why we have, Rosa Parks and not Claudette. Like there's reasons for that. So it's like knowing when it's so deep rooted even in our own history, it's really hard to not like look up to these people and be like, oh my God, like they're so amazing. They did all this for the community. But at the same time, they're like very bad legacies that were left that we have to undo. But it's also so hard because it's literally in like it's a white supremacist thing to promote colorism. So it's like, obviously we can't do it all by ourselves. But I just feel like it's awkward when you learn about this stuff later and you're like, dang, like I really used to look up to this person, but they were playing into this. Like, I feel like it changes my whole perspective on like what it means to be pro-Black and all this stuff. Cause I'm like, there's so many people who just be doing the bare minimum, you know, get a little fame for their skin tone, and then they're the social justice warrior. But there's hella people with darker skin been doing this, but nobody want to listen. So it's like, I don't know how to feel.
Yeah, like even for example, we were talking about one day we were talking about how like Angela Davis gets so much clout for all the prison abolition work she does, right? And how she's the greatest movement leader. You have people like who are currently in policy and stuff like Kamala Harris or Angela Rye. You have people who speak on political issues like Amanda Seales, and it just, the list goes on. And no one really talks about, okay, well, how are all these light-skinned women speaking on behalf of the Black experience, but not experiencing fully what Black people go through? And why is it that there is no conversation of colorism even being brought up with them? Oh, it's because they're benefiting off of colorism. It's because they got those privileges from being light-skinned. And so no one ever talks about it, and we're not having it. We're not having it because it's not that dark-skinned women are not out there on the forefront doing that work, but it's that light-skinned women are getting that privilege to be the face of the movement, to be the advocates for all these issues, and not have to even deal with the repercussions of being light-skinned and taking away the voices of dark-skinned people. So that's just a whole conversation.
And like when people try to say it's not that deep, like literally Rosa Parks gets the whole, like obviously MLK does too, but the whole clout for like the bus boycott and being the main initiation of that, right? Like that's a huge part of like our Black history in America. And then knowing that, you know, Claudette, who didn't get that same fame, was a darker skinned woman who was literally did the exact same thing, but nobody knows her name. Like that to me is crazy. Like I always would be like, you know, we're the Black community, we have to salvage our own history, but it just goes under the rug because Rosa Parks, she was popping, she was the face, and she was able to carry the movement where it needed to go. Like she got it from A to Z, and like that's what needed to happen. But it's just so disappointing when you learn it later. You're like, I feel like I learned fake history because I went to a predominantly like Black school that taught a lot of Black history. So like you learn about Rosa Parks like every day, like you know this woman to a T, and you're like, she is that and more. And then you get older, and then you just learn about all these other issues, and you're like, what did I really learn? Because I'm like, there's so many things I didn't know that I found out now that's been covered up, and it's a lot to take in, and it's disappointing how rooted it is in our community.
Yeah, and like speaking on like rooted in our community, let's talk about just what happened this past I think it was last week on Twitter. The Ethiopians and Eritreans were just going mad crazy. They were going
Lord.
Yeah, so if y'all did not hear, there was a tweet made by a light-skinned girl who identifies as Ethiopian, and how she was basically talking about how she receives oppression based off of her light skin, and that the oppression that she receives is much greater than what dark-skinned women within her community receive. And we're not going to say her name because we don't want to give her clout, you know, actually
Period.
let her benefit off of that dumb tweet. But let's talk about that, because I think, you know, even within our community as Ethiopian and Eritreans, there's so much colorism that's never talked about. And you see it through media, you see it through, I mean, forget that. Even back home, the bleaching cream thing, like, I know that's a big thing in Africa, but like, you know, us being Ethiopian and Eritrean visiting the countries, how has that made you see a lot of things differently just from the Black community in general, like, you know, Black diaspora, but how has that made you see colorism in a whole nother perspective when it comes to our community specifically?
Well, I guess like a benefit, right, of having that connection of being able to go back home is like, okay, I'm rooted in my Africanness, my Blackness. Like this is where I'm supposed to be fully accepted and know my roots to like, you know, 100%, right? Hypothetically. But then you go back home and you just see like the same issues are kind of global, right? Colorism is so deep rooted as it is in America, as it is back home. Like it's the same thing. So I guess I was naive the first time I went to Africa, or just going back home in general, of thinking like, you know, this is a safe haven for Black people, and like this is where we really thrive. And it is, I mean, but like I didn't think that it was that bad. Like I thought here and there, but it's not like that serious because, you know, we're all Black and like, you know, we love our melanin. But like going back home and seeing how deep rooted it was, I was like, dang, like there's so like how you can't even deconstruct the situation when people don't even deep it like that. Like nobody's even talking about it. So it's just really different because here I feel like we do create the conversation more because we see it in our life. But back home, it's just kind of like, we're all black at the end of the day. Like, why are we talking about this? Like, people kind of look at you crazy. I feel like if you even brought it up, they would just be like, it's not that serious. Like, you're doing too much. So, yeah, how do you feel about it though?
Yeah, I feel like post-colonialism really had like a big effect back home because, so many people are so washed in how we even perceive skin tone. And like people think it's perfectly natural to like lighter skin. And I'm like, no, like that's not cool, you know? And so it's so much deep-rooted ignorance in really why light skin has even been valued in Africa because, we're a continent full of how many different skin tones. And so when you have mainstream media within our countries start promoting light skin as, the ideal skin tone of what people from our countries look like, you create this false narrative of what is even considered beauty in Africa and even a beauty standard in general and how we accept or don't accept back home. It's not really much of a conversation with men. Like at the end of the day, people aren't really concerned really on much how like men's skin tone plays a part, even though it's still very much a big issue. It's very highlighted in the way that we see women back home and how women will receive roles in movies or get more popularity as musicians, or even just in general when it comes to marriage proposals and dating preferences. A lot of people are always looking for a light-skinned woman. And so back home, I just noticed that it's a huge thing now where, not even now, actually it's been a while, but seeing it now, it's much of a bigger problem to us, seeing women still bleaching their skin and even bleaching cream being a popular thing being sold back home. So I for me, like when I first was comparing the two, I didn't think of it as back home was a bit as big as a deal as it was here. But looking at it in very recent time, I think honestly back home in Eritrea and Ethiopia, it's a much bigger issue than it is here. Because here, people aren't trying to bleach their skin, getting bleaching cream from the Walgreens. But back home, it's the complete opposite. It's like if you don't have bleaching cream, you're weird. And if you're not constantly sitting inside while the sun is out, then you're weird. How women just have to look a certain way to even be perceived as beautiful back home is just, it's so disgusting and sad.
Also, like, makes me think about like bringing it back to America because obviously like we lived here longer and like we only go back home certain times in the year. Just thinking about like dating preferences in general, do you think that people could just be like, I've heard this comment a lot, I just prefer lighter skin? Like, I don't know, like for me, I just don't check people. I didn't check people before when they said stuff like that because I would just be like, oh, that's their preference. Like, I guess like I would try to get something out of them to remind them like, that's kind of not something you should say, but like I could never fully like be like that's colorist, like that's wrong, or this is problematic in this way. I've always just kind of been like, well, if that's your preference, that's your preference. So do you think that people genuinely could just have a preference that lands them with lighter skinned people without it being colorist? Like now looking back on it, I just feel like that's not, like I don't feel like people should be saying that ever. Like I just prefer a certain shade or skin tone of people, but I definitely played a part in that myself. So I'm not denying that, but looking back on it now, I'm like, that's so problematic. But how do you feel about it?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's so tricky when you like think about preferences because of course gender is like a perfectly acceptable preference to some people in a very heterosexual mindset. But when you're thinking about it in a homosexual mindset, gender is not really a big deal for people. So I think within preference and how we look at it with skin tone, I think it's very problematic because we're not sitting there saying, oh, well, it's just because they're light skinned, because there's no such thing as it's just because they're light skinned. There's something deep rooted within you that makes you want to have that preference. And that's what you got to check. But not a lot of people know how to even get to that deep rooted issue that they have. So they think it's just, oh, like I just always have a preference for light skinned women. I'm always happening to date light skinned women. Those are just the women that come in my life that I happen to think that are beautiful. And it's like, it's not because you're under exposure to dark skinned women, but it's because of the way that you've aligned your vision to only see light skinned women as beautiful. And that's the same thing when you put it in context of light skinned women talking about dark skinned men and wanting dark skinned men and not really preferring much of light-skinned men. And how there's a whole trend on like, oh, I need a dark-skinned, tall man. I need him all muscular. It's crazy because we don't even think about, okay, well, why do you want that? Like, why do light-skinned women want that? And that's because there's this attachment of traits with certain skin tones. And so with light skin, it's, femininity and being seen as soft and caring and lovable. And then with darker skin tones, a lot of people have added this trait of masculinity. So strength, being strong, aggressiveness. And obviously people in society, I don't know why, think it's much more attractive for a man to be aggressive and masculine and strong and stuff. And then when it comes to like women, having her as light skin is just seen as more acceptable. But then you see there's this odd group out of dark skinned women that are now seen as masculine, aggressive. And so when people say angry Black woman, that's what it's rooted in. It's the idea that there's aggressiveness within their skin tone.
Like, they're all in the head, but I just have to call myself out because I remember, like, we'd have conversations, like niggas would come up. First of all, I'm so pro-Black. I love my Black kings. But every time we talk about it, like in the friend group, like there's always that comment of like, oh, so would you go for a light skin or a dark skin, right? Like this was just in conversation. Like we didn't even deep that's problematic from the get-go. Why are we asking people what shade they prefer? I told you I like Black men. That's it. Let it go. Like just leave it at that. But when we're entertaining the conversation, I will always remember making jokes and being like, oh, like I would never date light-skinned nigga, like they're too cute, they're too pretty, or da-da, like playing into that thing of light-skinned men being too cute or too pretty. I always make jokes like that. So just like looking back on myself, like obviously I don't make those comments anymore, but at a point in time, like I did, and I did play into that and think it was okay. But it's definitely not okay. But I do remember like it was a normal conversation at the table. Like if we're talking about relationships and niggas and we want to date and men, Black men in particular, that shade conversation always came up. Like, oh yeah, I know you're not gonna date a dark skin nigga, or I know you're gonna end up with a light skin. Why are you so pressed about what type of shade the man I'm gonna end up with it is? Just know he's gonna be Black. That's it. There's nothing else to talk about. Like, why are we doing this? And it just happened so often that I was like, looking back, I'm like, why do we even do that? Like, that's so cringe. Like, looking back on it now, I'm like, ugh, like, why did I say that? But I don't know if you remember any other triggering statements that come up in the group, but that was just one I just really reflected on. I was like, yikes, like, I really said that with my whole chest.
Yeah, no, I think one thing that was so constant was people always commenting on my skin tone when they found me attractive. And that was like the first thing that was brought up is like, oh, you're so beautiful, like you're exotic, like these keywords that they would use to describe my skin tone. And a lot of times I would just kind of let it go and not really deep it. But I noticed it so much coming from Black men that I was constantly conflicted on like, oh, okay, well, is this like out of good intention? Like, why are you calling me exotic? Like what traits of my physical identity make me so exotic? And so seeing that, okay, like I don't have kinky hair, I don't have dark skin, obviously starts playing into the colorism role of viewing me as more Eurocentric and not as standard as people want to perceive what Black looks like. And so always getting those comments from men of, you don't even look like you're full Black. And that seeming like a compliment to me was so weird. I was always thinking to myself, like, why do I always say stupid stuff like, oh, I want a dark-skinned man? And it was because I was playing into that colorist idea of, okay, dark-skinned men are much more masculine. It's something that a lot of other people are attracted in. Like, I need to be attracted to that. And that's what everyone's going to see as attractive. And that's what causes this issue of dark-skinned women being left and why dark-skinned men are, fishing for light-skinned women. And that's because society has set those standards and we're falling into those standards. And we're allowing ourselves to be victims of that culture. And then once we become those victims, we then become perpetrators and actually start perpetuating the culture.
Okay, I have another question though. So when it comes to like, growing and like trying to, deconstruct these ideas and stuff, like for me, it's really hard when it's people I'm not friends with, but like acquaintances, like, guys be swiping up or sliding in your DM or someone you just meet and like, they're obviously just trying to be cool with you. So they might slide a little comment like, I love your light skin, or you cute, da da da, and then light skin just comes up and you're like, whoa, like I was trying to be your friend, but like now I have to take a step back. And like, I don't know, that's happened to me multiple times where for me, if you're black and like you cool, like I obviously want to be cool with you like right away because like I love black people and I want that connection. But it's just weird because I'm like, is that going to start beef? Because like I just want to have, a normal conversation of being like, yo, like appreciate the comment, but why'd you say it this way? Like, I don't know of any normal way of like checking someone without it going left because I know I needed to be checked at some point and I never was really checked. I just have to check myself essentially and like do the work and research and understand this like the concepts. But some people, everyone gets there at a different pace. Everyone does their own research. They fall into new information in different ways. So it's not like I feel like I have to police them, but then I also genuinely don't feel comfortable engaging in conversation when someone brings up my skin tone in that way because I already know what time it is. Like I already know where your head's at. So I just know our conversation's gonna go left if I keep entertaining it. So like I don't know what to do in that situation. I've just had to like not talk to people because of it because I'm like, this too much. Like you say you pro black, but you out here spinning those colors stuff. I'm like, ugh, I gotta go. Like I don't know. How do you feel about, I guess, bringing it up in conversation in real life to people who aren't just friends, but like acquaintances or people you just know?
Hmm. I mean, I'm constantly shaking the room, so I'm not gonna just sit there and be susceptible to like people's hate rhetoric or culture that they're trying to spew on me. And sometimes that lands me into people blocking me. Sometimes that lands people, spewing their toxic masculinity. Shout out to Black men for doing that to me. And
Ooh.
and yeah, like I just think one huge thing is you always have to stay like true to yourself and know that if something's wrong, then it's wrong. And there's no dark skinned woman that's in that space with me. So it's my job to make sure that I'm protecting dark skinned women as just as much as I would want them to protect me in spaces. And it's so wrong for light skinned women to think that, okay, I can do this behind doors, but in public, I have to just make sure that I look good. It doesn't matter when you do it or how you do it. Once you do it, you're damaging our women. You're just furthering a problem that is going to make it even 10 times harder for us to break the cycle for the next generations to come. Yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, it's weird. Yes, you probably will get attacked for it. But yeah, you have to just sometimes really just rip the band-aid off and let people know, like, if they're being problematic, they're being problematic. Of course, you can bring it up in ways that aren't so aggressive and rude, like, oh, like, don't be coming at somebody like, oh, you ain't shit, like, fuck you, like, you get blocked. With any type of learning experience, making sure that the person understands that you're coming from a place of wanting to help them and not necessarily of critiquing them just because you want to make them feel bad. I think that can also just set a tone. But then some people just are born and want to just be problematic for the rest of their life. So you can't help those people. You really can't.
Yeah, that's real. That's what I was just reflecting on because I'm like, at the end of the day, like now I'm at a point where I just don't care. Like I'm going to respectfully address things on any spectrum of anything that I don't feel comfortable with. But there was a little bit too much, like there's a really long phase where I was just kind of like, just not going to say something because it's uncomfortable and I don't have to talk about it. So I'm going to just let it go. Or it's like you're like, oh, is it really that deep? And you try to like convince yourself that they really didn't mean it in that way. I'd be like, oh, they were just trying to be like nice, like they're just trying to give me a compliment. Like I'm the one exaggerating, like trying to convince yourself it's something else so you don't have to address it. Like I remember I would just be like, nah, they're just trying to be nice. Like now you're just doing too much. Like try to sweep it under the rug. So I feel like, yeah, I feel like now I'm just like, it is what it is. Like if you hate me after, cool. If you don't want to converse, that's fine. But just making sure that I'm not being rude about it and just, being respectful and just making sure it's not coming off disrespectful.
Yeah. And unfortunately we don't have a dark skinned woman to like answer this question, but I just wanted to see like your perspective really on like if light skinned people are obviously beneficiaries of the colorist
Like
culture.
propaganda.
Yeah,
Oh,
like
culture, yeah.
colorism culture. How much can we really speak on these things until we have overstepped our boundary? Because I think that's something I dibble dabble with a lot and just trying to always figure out, well, am I overdoing something or if am I speaking out of my place because I can't speak on a dark skinned woman's perspective or her experiences. I can't speak on behalf of dark skinned women in general, because we have already seen how problematic that is. So what do you think is like a big no-no for light skinned people to be saying when we have the conversation of colorism?
To be real, I think it's like the centrism. Like, there's always, whenever we talk about colorism, right, it's always from a space of, light skinned people, how do you feel about all those compliments you get about your skin tone? Or how hard is it to tell your coworker that you don't want them tanning your skin, like your shade? Like, that's not colorism. And so I feel like until even now, like, obviously, we can't even have an in depth conversation about colorism because we don't experience it. We only experience the better end of it, which is what colorism perpetuates. We don't deal with the actual colorism that happens in the world. So it's like knowing that, first of all, it's a traumatizing experience. Like, I wouldn't, if I experience colorism, I don't think I want to be talking about it, to be honest. So knowing that, like, I have a privilege to complain about colorism because I don't really experience it is one thing in itself. Because at the end of the day, like, I know as a Black woman, I go through hella stuff and I don't feel like talking about that stuff. So why, on top of what I already go through, would I want to sit here and tell you all to understand me and my experience as a darker skinned woman? Like, I just don't see anyone wanting to do that labor. And so it makes sense to me now of why we have so many lighter skinned people as like the point of interest, or like the face, or like just feeling comfortable talking about it. Because at the end of the day, you're not dealing with shit. I'm gonna be honest. I'm not dealing with shit. I'm dealing with having lighter skin and people maybe mistaking me for being mixed. That's not a struggle, honey. It's like, you need to pick a struggle, and this is not one. So it's like, I can't sit here and cap and act like my life is hard. It's not. So I feel like that's one thing we need to like figure out, is how are we going to pass the mic without it being re-traumatizing for someone? Because I just know, like, I'd be getting so mad when people ask me questions about racism. Like, you just don't want to, there's a point where you just tap out. Like, you're like, this is such basic stuff. Like, just look it up on Google. I don't want to tell you because I'm tired. So how do we, I guess, respectfully pass the mic without it being like exhausting for the people who actually deal with colorism? I haven't yet seen an effort be made though, where like lighter skinned people were like, okay, how do we make sure we're not taking up all these seats, or we're not the face of the movement? Because it continues to happen again and again and again, and nobody says anything. I don't know. It's just weird because we haven't gotten to that point of realizing that until we're all on the same page, a lot of our community isn't being helped, but somehow we're okay with that. So I don't know what that'll look like, but the mic needs to be tossed. I just don't know what it looks like.
Hmm. One thing for me is like there has to be a there has to be a stop to this culture of people trying to speak on behalf of others that they obviously don't share experiences with. So how do light skinned people bring up this conversation of colorism without being problematic within itself? And I think it's so important to make sure that we empathize, but not overdo it to the point where we're trying to speak for them and silence their voices and experiences. And that dark skinned women in particular deserve to have a platform and have needed that platform for so long. And that light skinned women need to learn how to step down and know that they have taken up spaces where they should not have taken them up in the first place. And that there are dark skinned women out there that have earned those spaces and have always held those spaces down. When we learn how to empathize and we learn how to, create those spaces and even exist in the same spaces without feeling like we have to take away chances from dark skinned women, I think that will change a lot more of the way that we can have these conversations of colorism. Because right now, there's just so much dark skinned women that are being pushed out of opportunities, being pushed away from conversations, and having light skinned women speak on their behalf.
And this is not a small thing, but like even representation, right? So like, what was the movie that we watched together? It was like The Hate U Give, and I believe in the book the main character was dark skinned,
Mm.
but wasn't a lighter skinned woman casted. So it's just like the constant erasure of like darker skinned women is so normalized that it's like, how are we even gonna call stuff out when media is doing it? We're doing it within our own communities. We don't acknowledge it ever. So it's like there's so many places of erasure, and I feel like it's more disappointing when it's our own community, because like we're supposed to be the safe space, we're supposed to be uplifting each other. So it's like, how dumb do we look when we're out here preaching Black Lives Matter, but more than half the community isn't even in the loop. We're not even acknowledging their existence. Like, I just don't know how pro-Black we could be if we're not uplifting each other. But I think also people make colorism like a I don't know, like a juicy conversation that happens just to stir the pot, and that there's no actual systemic problems like tied to it. Like lighter skinned women don't get incarcerated as high of a rate as darker skinned women. Like, that's real. Like, that's literally systemic things. Like, that's white supremacy in itself. So I just feel like we need to get to a point where we deep that this is more than just, you dating a lighter skin or darker skin person based off their shade, which is very problematic and should change, but also that people are being affected systemically. Like, I don't think people make that correlation. I think we just sit here and be like, oh, they're just doing too much because they just don't want to date a lighter skin person. They want to date a darker skin person, or vice versa. And it's like, if that's all colorism was, that would have been a very different conversation if it was just preference, because we could work through those and talk to each other. But it's just so deep rooted that we don't even see how much it's hurting each other, and how we're hurting each other, and how the system is hurting all of us. But not all of us are getting hurt the same, but we can't see that for some reason.
Like, I feel like a lot of people are exposed to it.
So you think people are just like choosing to be like, nah, I'm not gonna, like, I'm just gonna ignore it, or just act like it's not there for, like, because it's uncomfortable, or
Well, no. Okay, so here's my thing. So, like with white people, oftentimes when you check them, like, oh yeah, you're benefiting off of this, and this, and that. It's like, oh shit. Well, I didn't want to benefit off of it. Like, I'm so sorry. Like,
mm-hmm.
they're just overdoing it with the way that they try to sympathize and empathize with like Black people, right? I feel like it's the same exact thing with light skinned people, and they're having this constant war of like, oh well, I didn't want these privileges, and I didn't want to make you feel that way, but it's like, hey, you have it, you're benefiting off of it. Now you have a choice to either combat it or continue with that benefit. And a lot of them are choosing the benefit because it's easier and it's not shaking up their lives and taking away the privileges that they've already become accustomed to. And so they don't have to sit there and risk not being complimented or seen as beautiful anymore because they're defying colorism. And that's really like the tea when it comes to this conversation of colorism. Is a lot of light-skinned people don't want their privileges taken away from them, and that if they have their privileges taken away from them, they don't know how to act.
I could see that though, because I feel like you could see all these things and then just choose to, like, when it's relevant, or when it's safe, behind closed doors, be like, hey, probably shouldn't be doing these things. But to the public, if you're benefiting off, like, why, if you're benefiting off of a system, why would you check it, right, in that particular space? So I could see that, and I definitely agree. I also feel like that's what makes it harder, right? Because realistically, you are gaining a certain privilege, but it's like you already are, like, as a Black person, how messed up the system is. So it's like, I just feel like it's our duty to not be sleep. Like, you need to wake up. Like, you already know how messed up our whole system is. So why would you want to benefit off this one thing because you just don't care enough to help everyone else? Like, I don't know. I'm not saying that everyone has to be selfless, but I just feel like it's not a lot to give up in the regards of, like, all of us. Like, this is something we all need. So it's like, I just don't feel bad. Like, as a lighter skinned person, that's my job. Like, why am I going to sit here and pout when I'm literally benefiting off the system that is hurting all of us?
And I think it's so funny because me and Monty have these conversations all the time. And when it does come in group settings outside of just me and her, oftentimes a lot of people are like, oh, like you guys are like trying to overdo it with pro-Black stuff, or like you guys are just being over controlling of the way that people think, and that it's not a big deal, and this is not going to hurt the overall movement for pro-Black everything. And I'm like, okay, of course you're going to think about this in a very minimalistic scale, because that's what you've been taught to think, that it's just a minimal, like a little micro issue, when in reality it's such a macro issue because we keep perpetuating it and it's only getting bigger. It's not growing smaller. Like, colorism is not any better than it was how many years ago? Like, why is it that people have this idea that you saying a slick comment is not going to hurt anybody, but you don't know who's around to hear that, or you don't know if the people that you are having that conversation with might be offended by what you're saying? And so, yes, we're light skinned and yes, we benefit off those things, but it's like, I'm not going to sit there and just be like, oh, it's okay that you're saying that for this one time, because I already know how one time can become multiple times, and multiple times can become a lifetime of making a wrongful comment and not realizing how colorist it can be.
I also feel like it depends on like your upbringing and like, everyone comes in different shades, and like I can't remember where I watched this, but there was like a show or movie or like a mom was talking about how she is lighter skinned, but I guess her daughter is darker than her, and she was talking about how she would basically be telling her daughter like kind of, those comments of like, oh, you're darker, so life's gonna be hard for you type of talk. And so for me, I was just like, yeah, I get it. Like, you're a lighter skinned woman. You don't fully understand what your daughter's going through. But I also think, like, wouldn't that be a great space to, like, uplift your daughter and not continuously perpetuate that darker skinned people have a harder time? Obviously, I'm not a mother. I can't speak to that experience. But just knowing that even within our, bonds with our family, it's really hard to talk about it. So it's like, how do you uplift her in your home? Because the world isn't going to love her as much. You know that. So it's like, what are you doing at home to push, like, support her and uplift her and make sure she loves her skin? Because I think the saddest thing I've seen on Twitter is a lot of people being like, I finally, love my skin tone. Like, I actually love the way I look. It's like, how, like, you have to live your whole life feeling like you needed to do something different to fit into the world. So I don't know, just seeing stuff like that really just brings it back where I'm like, how are we going to do this if we can't do it with our own families? Like, let alone the whole community. Like, it feels very minimal to just be like, it starts with your parents, starts with your kids, starts with your family, but it really does, because we're telling ourselves the same information. Like, we hear this stuff in our households and we're mute, and then it happens in the real world and we're shook. Like, obviously it's gonna continue. So I don't know.
Yeah, like just deconstruct, like people don't understand the culture of deconstruction and how deconstructing has like multiple levels to it, and that if you're not able to deconstruct somewhere, that it's going to end up hurting another place. And so if you don't deconstruct in the home, then you're going to see a rise in colorist culture outside of the home. And that's just that just furthers the need for, the need for just demolishing the system. So it's just hard.
Burn it down.
Yeah, like it's just hard knowing that so many people are working against trying to create this culture of loving all Black skin tones.
I was gonna say, like, when it comes to awareness, I also feel like it really depends on what you've heard growing up. Because, like, for me, even though I've heard all the positive things, I've also heard like comments from family members who are like, "Oh, I was your skin tone," like, and you kind of think like, why? When you're still young and you don't really fully understand colorism and what that is and why lighter skin is seen as more beautiful. So I feel like for me, I just always question, like, people older than you and your family are talking about your skin tone. It's like, whoa, like, why are we doing this? Like, I'm too young to even understand this. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I feel like as lighter skinned women and like as people who benefit off of this, I feel like we need to find ways to toss the mic. And I just don't know what that looks like currently, but it just needs to happen sooner rather than later, because this has been going on for way too long.
And we've obviously seen what happens when light skinned women are ahead in the mid. So we're obviously not doing a good job. So and that's the real tea. But without further ado, I think we can go ahead and just close this episode. Shout out to y'all for tuning in.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see y'all next week.